How is it going, everybody? My name is DeMarco, and if you've been following Starfield at all, you know at this point that Todd Howard has done a wonderful interview with the folks over at Xcast, and it confirmed a lot of great details. It's going to be disappointing to some, exciting to others, but we're going to break down the points I found most interesting in this video. If you wanted to see completely everything that was talked about, just watch the video itself. I'll leave it linked down in the description below. But first off, I wanted to start with the elements I thought would be found as the most controversial. And I say that very loosely, but there are three things in particular I think might upset some folks. Now, the interview does start off, I do want to point out that he says the passion and the excitement for this game has really helped to fuel the studio. The feedback that they've been getting after the Starfield Direct has really helped to continue to invigorate the passion of the developers leading to the launch. And I can't stress enough, just as someone who does something creative, when you see that positive feedback, it does help create this very positive loop as a creator on YouTube. When I see those types of comments, it emboldens me to keep making more videos with the same amount of energy. So for them to get that on the developer side, working on this massive project, is absolutely awesome. But Todd Howard very early on does confirm that there's going to be no land vehicles, and more disappointing to me, no mounts. No mountable creatures in Starfield, despite the ability to tame them.
Todd, we land on these planets and people are blown away by the size and the scope of things. Is there a land vehicle or an option to maybe mount some of these wildlife creatures to use as a land transportation mode of transport?
There is not. You know, we do design it. I think when we've seen this with our other games where we want to design it so it feels good on foot. But we do have the boost pack. You saw some of that in the video, and you have skills for the boost pack. So the boost pack almost acts like this vehicle. It's super fun where you can fly through, and then the low gravity planets are just really something special in the game.
Now, there is a positive to take away from this, at least a positive that I'm seeing, which is Todd Howard does explicitly state that their worlds are designed to be explored on foot. And this is a good thing. The reason being because you're not going to have a location 5,000 meters away that you hop in your buggy or you get on your alien mount, which again, I would have liked to see those, but you get on it and then you go for 5,000 meters in any direction and find absolutely nothing along the way until you get to the location you're trying to get to. That's not very riveting gameplay, I would say. If you want to land on a barren planet and just explore and walk around, you have that opportunity, as we know. But as far as finding the points of interest, you don't have these massively spread out locations for the sake of embellishing and fluffing out the playtime. I will also say, as a massive fan of Elder Scrolls, it really is promising for the Elder Scrolls 6 that they're not going to just stuff, because they have all these new procedural generation systems, they're not just going to make the map humongous for the sake of doing so, assuming they maintain that mentality of building worlds designed to explore on foot. That's a good thing to me. Now, the second thing is that only 10% of the worlds will contain life.
About 10% of those planets have life on them. Again, we're pushing it to the edge of what do people think, what planets are in that Goldilocks zone versus planets that have resources. Add too many things, if it's generating too many abandoned bases or towers or things to find, it starts feeling too gamey in some of those locations. So I think we've dialed that in pretty well.
Now, my personal take on that, I don't mind seeing a more gamey game. I'm playing a video game after all. But as far as striking a good balance, I think Bethesda, and I trust their judgment with this, for Bethesda to create a good balance between the amount of locations you could explore versus the amount of planets that there are. If you assume that there's going to be roughly 3 points of interest per planet spread across 100 different planets, you're looking at about 300 locations that are handcrafted but procedurally placed you can go explore. And that sounds good to me. Fallout 4 had about 325 marked locations in the game. Skyrim in the base game had about 338. So this is exactly on par with about what you would expect from another Bethesda game. And of course, he does mention that just because there is a lifeless world doesn't mean you're not going to find anything on that planet. There still will be something here and there. It's just not going to be these big primary fleshed out locations that Bethesda typically creates. Now, assuming that there are roughly 300 points of interest in Starfield, the hope would be that since it is around the same amount we've seen in past Bethesda games, but we know Bethesda is much larger than they were in the past, ideally these locations are a lot more fleshed fleshed out and a lot more built out, and there's much more personality to each of them, making them feel very unique from one another and worth exploring. And I cannot stress enough that I really do trust Bethesda's judgment about striking that balance between the amount of things to do in the game versus how well fleshed out they feel. He kind of confirms something I've been saying for a very long time, which is the overall gameplay loop to exploration in Starfield for most people.
It is an exploration different than we've had, where you're landing, you're exploring around that landing spot, and then you're probably going somewhere else.
This is something I brought up in the past as a bit of a concern. I don't know if that's going to be as fun for everybody as it is exploring a whole location on foot as you can in past Bethesda games. Now, of course, you need to have that general loop for the sake of the space game with 1,000 planets. That's just how it's going to play out. But I do see some folks who are going to get a bit tired of the repetition. Do the one thing, back in the ship, find another thing, do it, get back in the ship, find the next thing. And I feel as though some folks might see that to become a bit monotonous. The time where it would start to feel tedious is if the locations don't feel worthwhile to investigate, and I don't believe that's going to be a problem since Bethesda's locations have improved greatly over their past couple games. And lastly, and this might be a bit of a bigger one, which is there's only 4 companions, all of them are members of Constellation, that have full quest lines and are romanceable. Now I think maybe I'm looking a bit too deeply, but the key word here is have full quest lines and romanceable. So that's not to say there's not going to be additional companions outside of that. I mean, the Adoring Fan, I guarantee you, does not have a full quest line and probably does not have a romance option, but he can still tag along and join you for adventures. So there's more than just the 4, but it's significantly less as far as having full fleshed out quest lines than what we've seen in the past. In Fallout 4, you had roughly 12, and they all had, that's not including Dogmeat, and they all kind of had their own quest lines attached to them, given they weren't expanded with all the romance options that we're going to probably see in Starfield, but there was a lot more, and they all had strong personalities to make them feel distinct from one another. So I can understand how a lot of folks might see this as a big step back from what we've gotten in the past from Bethesda. Now, my biggest concern comes with the fact that they're all members of Constellation and they don't extend beyond that. We've seen factions like the Red Mile, the Crimson Fleet, House Faroon, and yet there's no romanceable options in any other area. All of them happen to be a part of Constellation, which was an interesting choice to me, unless they're keeping something secret. It does explain why the followers in Starfield or in Constellation are so diverse from one another, because that's what they were trying to build. But what I need to see from Bethesda, assuming that this is all there is in the game, each of these companions need to feel as fleshed out as, say, Inigo. If you've ever played Skyrim and haven't used the mod Inigo, do yourself a favor, try it out. And if all of the followers, the 4 romanceable options with their full quest lines, feel as fleshed out and as built out and as personalized as Inigo does, that to me is a fair trade-off. You do have to weigh out how much time and attention are certain companions going to get versus how many are we going to put in the game. And assuming they put a lot more emphasis into the former, then it can be done well. But if we see the same amount of content pertaining to each of these followers as what we got in the likes of Fallout 4, where there were 12 of them, then it is a step in the wrong direction. And that's something we will have to wait until Starfield comes out to make a full judgment. So those are the 3 more controversial elements I think people will stick to, and let me know your thoughts about each of them down in the comment section below. The number of planets, the companions and romance options, and on top of that, the lack of any type of ground transport besides your jet boost, which you can use to get around. Conversely, there's some things in this interview I thought were really, really great. I'm happy that Todd Howard spoke to them. He did mention, and he said this in the past, that the questions we are asking and that we're concerned about are things that Bethesda has at one point or another raised internally themselves, and that fills me with confidence when they're building this product, that they're really considering all these options and trying to do what they think is the most fun. An example of that is cutting the fuel mechanic. Todd Howard has mentioned in the past how they did have a mechanic where you could get stranded. They tested it out, they said it wasn't that fun, so they ultimately removed it from the game. Someone, if they want, can probably restore that type of function with a mod, but for the sake of the base vanilla game, they thought it wasn't that fun. And that's good that they at least tried it and tested it. One thing that I really appreciated Todd Howard speaking to was endgame content, and he mentions how the outpost building as well as the ship crafting really are things that are meant to be done later on in the experience, because they are either very credit heavy, where it's a big financial investment, or it's very resource heavy in order to build your outposts. And that's great. We've heard Todd Howard talk in the past about how these games are meant to last longer and longer. He wants people playing them for 10 years and all those great comments. But this is a good way to do it. It helps to balance the economy, and it helps to provide you new things to do as you keep progressing. Now, we know historically speaking that it's not that hard to earn money in Bethesda games. Whether it's not, it's going to be different for Starfield, yet remains to be seen. But I do like this idea of the building your own spaceship. While it's one of the more exciting features in the game, is something you genuinely need to work towards in order to unlock. It's something you need to save up for. It's something you need to plan ahead. Now, that doesn't mean that you cannot craft and upgrade your ships in advance. You absolutely can.
It is, in a good way, a very complicated system, and one that it was more of a longer term thing in the game. You can easily upgrade your ship, like just go in and say, I want to improve these weapons, I want to improve the grav drive or the shields. That's very, very easy to do. But where you go in that mode and you break it apart and you're building, that is a whole mode onto itself. That is more of a long-term play kind of thing.
He does mention you pay a fee in order to register your spaceship, you bring it in, and then you could upgrade just the engines or just upgrade the guns and those sorts of things. But the full-on ship crafting mechanic is a massive investment. As far as pacing the game and the story and laying out content to keep doing, that's a good way to balance it. And I assume it's going to be roughly similar to Fallout 4's settlement system, where early on, at least the way I played, I always put a lot of resources and everything into just building up one single settlement. And then as I started getting further on in the game, I would start expanding others and building out more in all the different locations that you could do it. This is probably going to be the same with both the spaceships and with the outposts. He also mentions a really cool detail that you do get rewarded for surveying the planet, scanning all the fauna and all the wildlife, and you can actually sell that data to somebody somewhere for credits. That's a really cool prospect. Again, it really does flesh out this idea that you can do anything you want. So if you just want to be that constellation explorer, you go out, you find planets, survey them, kind of like a Star Trek type experience, you can do exactly that. That's awesome. I do think it's also worth mentioning he does confirm this small subtle detail, which we kind of already knew, but he does confirm this smaller detail where the interior of the ship kind of comes, if you are doing the space building part, comes pre-made, so you cannot customize the interiors you pick from different modules. Those come with a preset design inside. A couple of smaller tidbits that we could kind of speed through a little bit. Todd Howard does acknowledge you can have an entire ship that's manned by robots, which is honestly kind of cool to think about. So you can staff your ships individually and you could assign them to different ships, and then on one particular one it could be an entirely robot fueled ship. That's pretty cool to me. Of course, not all of them are going to be like Vasco. They also do talk about the radio station. I mentioned this in my in-depth analysis video that there is some kind of a settled system news network, although it's very limited to where you can get that radio signal, so that's worth mentioning. There are builds and perks that allow you to specialize in playing the game solo, so if you don't want to journey out in space with companions, you can make a character that has that specific type of build. And then he also mentions that companions can get angry at you. He doesn't say they'll leave your party if you annoy them too much, but they can get mad, and the consequences of that we'll have to deal with. But this is something that he's mentioned in the past as well. Lastly, they mentioned bad monsters, and he says there's one in particular that's very bad, and I suspect he's referring to this one that's been teased as this horrifying monster element. It's probably the Death Claw equivalent to Starfield. The last thing, and this is one of my favorite questions that was asked the entire panel, which was whether or not quests are going to feel a bit tedious, and how does Bethesda try to separate themselves from what they say as push button get reward dopamine fix, where a lot of them really do boil down to, oh, I've lost my trousers, can you go find them and I'll reward you with this weapon? And Todd says, honestly, the perfect answer. Have a listen for yourself.
There really is a lot of it, so we have a lot of specific quests, but it's not what you're talking about, the sort of random one-off ones. I don't think it's mutually exclusive. We obviously have a bunch of that.
Right.
You can land on a planet and go to an outpost, and we're going to generate a mission nearby, and you're going to see some of that. But I think that's okay if you know you're in for it. And those activities, if the gameplay is good, can be fun, but they shouldn't take the place of those more in-depth ones. And we've done a lot of those.
Right.
This is exactly what I needed to hear, that those are great as supplemental content, and it's okay that those types of quests exist, but they can't be the bulk of what you experience during the game. And I had that concern was raised for me when we did see during the Starfield Direct Showcase, there were quests that were like, go clear out this group of bandits, or the quest giver at one point, he outright says, oh, can you go off and I'm having trouble with the wildlife, go kill them for me. And that to me was not a great showcase of the type of interesting quests you can have. But Todd's acknowledgement of the fact that you need to have those side quests, yes, but also the more interesting, more intriguing, in-depth side quests that you can do that tell interesting stories, that set my mind at ease quite a bit. So it was a perfectly answered question. I'm really excited. I'm more excited for Starfield as a result of hearing that, and I'm curious to see exactly what the ratio Bethesda does for those go here, kill X, get reward, versus the more interesting, intriguing quest lines that they can build. So those were the more interesting points to me. If you want to see the whole interview, check out the link in the description. Show them the support, give them the view, give them a thumbs up for hosting this interview, for getting Todd Howard on the show. It was a great interview. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. I hope to see you all next time. So long, everybody.